Hi everybody. In this VR render video, take a look at 3 of the top real-time rendering engine software. We're going to take a look at Lumion 24, D5 Render, and Twinmotion, currently in its 24.1 version. We want to look at some of the strengths of these softwares, and also take a look at some of their limitations or weaknesses. If you're wondering what the best software for architectural rendering is, it's going to be the Unreal Engine. However, the Unreal Engine comes with a pretty steep learning curve, and for a lot of people involved in architectural visualization or even product visualization, might not actually need something as heavy or dense as the full Unreal Engine. In fact, 2 of the softwares that we look at today are built on the architecture, but don't require you to know anything about the underpinnings. We are going to compare and contrast each software on a number of factors, including its interface, its ease of use. We'll also look at their material library, how they handle PBR materials. We'll look at their internal foliage and 3D model assets, and we'll also look at how they handle media, still images, and video being our primary concern. These are the 3 software that I am most familiar with, both as a teacher as well as a user. Now, please note that there is no strict best software. The 3 that we look at here all come with strengths, and they do also have their own weaknesses. And at the very end of this video, we'll take a very, very critical look at the software, their pricing, and some of the culture around these programs. We'll also point out some of the issues with each of them. Please note, this video is intended for users who are maybe thinking of switching one software to another, or thinking of adding a new software to their toolkit. Perhaps they want to just learn a new software, or maybe you're looking at jumping ship to a new software for your professional work. Hopefully at the end of this video, you'll have a pretty good idea of the overall strengths and weaknesses, limitations, and some of the criticisms of the software. All right, let's go ahead and get into it. All right, everybody. So the first one we want to look at is Twinmotion. And Twinmotion is currently in version 2024.1. And Twinmotion is a real-time, primarily architectural visualization rendering software that is a part of the Unreal ecosystem. It is now a part of Epic Games. It is a real-time architectural visualization tool, although you'll notice if we just take a quick look here, is increasingly there has been a strong emphasis on not just the architectural visual part, which is sort of where Twinmotion got its start, but also automotive industry, fashion, and product design. Quite simply, Twinmotion is starting to dabble a little bit more into re-rendering that was primarily kind of geared towards specialized software. For example, product design primarily go hand in hand with Keyshot. We're currently in Lumion 2024, which has been the second of 2 sort of seismic leap forwards for Lumion, going from what was the stalwart 12.5 version up to Lumion 2023 and 2024. Now, we'll talk about Lumion 2023 at the end here, because there's no real way we can deny talking about it. But Lumion 2024 is again a effectively dual function render. Let's take a quick look. We have the default raster mode. This would be the more traditional rendering mode. This is not using ray trace. This is effectively using a lot of screen space magic. And, you know, this was for the longest the sort of standard sort of rendering. It's still really, really good. I want to show you just really quickly just a standard sort of rastered render within Lumion. I think it's absolutely stunning. This is just using the default sort of Lumion settings, not the ray tracing module. Now, we should also point out, Lumion does have a newer ray tracing component, and we'll talk about that in a moment. This brings us to D5. So D5 is a real-time ray-traced rendering engine. It features real-time ray tracing built on the Unreal Engine architecture and real-time global illumination. In many ways, it is the most modern, if you will, of the rendering engines that we're going to look at. And lately, over the past year and a bit, it has very heavily leaned into the use of AI in a very functional way. Instead of seeing AI as a gimmick, it's really done a good job of integrating AI into your actual workflow. Like Twinmotion, D5 is at its base, at its most bones, built upon the Unreal Engine architecture, but they've very much gone in two very slightly different directions, even though they're using the same underpinning. Now, we should point out D5's use of ray tracing, real-time ray tracing, and global illumination, even though it sort of started under the Unreal Engine, has very much become its own sort of bespoke thing. And it uses quite a number of really impressive technological advancements in terms of the programming for how it handles light and things like that. It's a very, very impressive and very modern program. The first thing we'll start with is interface. Recently, within I think the last 2 years, Twinmotion has gone under a bit of a facelift. The previous nested interface has been removed in lieu of a much more simplified layout. New users coming to Twinmotion, either those with or without any experience in rendering, will find the arrangement and layout of icons pretty easy to work with. Over here on the left, we have some materials and objects. We have very large, easy to read iconography at the bottom for import and export and media. Over here on the right, we have a pretty simple layout with a scene graph or scene tree for all of the objects in our scene. We have one giant button, the ambient button, that allows you to control the environment, the camera, the render settings, and to help set up some of your export. All in all, it's an incredibly simplified layout. The removal of all of the nested content has very much streamlined the workflow, and there's less time spent going into menus, and everything is readily accessible. If anything, one of the biggest problems with the Twinmotion interface is that, quite simply, it looks like the interface for a huge amount of other programs. There's been a push really over the last decade for an increased look for darker interface, and I think if memory serves, Autodesk may have kind of kicked this off, or maybe even Photoshop. Suffice it to say, the biggest complaint about the Twinmotion interface is that it sort of looks like every other kind of interface, which isn't necessarily a bad thing. It's very easy to read, very easy to work with, it's quite accessible. Now, I'm very aware that someone is going to post a comment saying that Twinmotion stole the interface from D5. This is not strictly speaking true at all. Most softwares are pushing for a more unified look, and it is going to be this darker interface. You'll notice that it is a very uncluttered interface. Most of your content will be on the bottom left here, and really the options for moving between like the different modes, video or render, things like that, a panorama, have all moved to the top left corner. In fact, if I move myself out of the way here, this is pretty much it. This is it. Recently, they moved a lot of the other options that were in the bottom right-hand corner to the top left, and while it's kind of annoying because you have to kind of retrain your brain, the interface, it's really, really open and clean. Now, a couple of other things you'll notice about this when I move myself back. Splash screen is pretty easy to work with. There's no real surprises here. You can save and load and everything else. Photo mode, video mode, and 360 panoramas are all accessible from the top left. The interface has really streamlined. It's, again, gone for a darker color palette, which is theoretically supposed to be easier on the eyes for users, but I think it reads very, very well. Now, one thing when you do start with Lumion is you'll have to kind of figure out where things are, and I think this is one of those things where I would argue it has a slightly higher initial learning curve. Just for example, knowing where like how to select materials, well, you do have to make sure that you're under the materials tab before you can really do anything with them. So for example, if I want to go in here, I can double click, but just knowing things like that, just a little bit of a slight learning curve. But once you do pick it up, Lumion is probably the most user-friendly sort of software that I think you can get at the moment. I think it's really, really good. They've done a great job at making it accessible for people who do not have a 3D background. Put it this way, there's two reasons why my school used Lumion. The first was that it's available for students and education institutions for free. Thanks, guys. But the second really important one is it's easy to pick up if you don't have a technical background. This is, I think, just absolutely one of the finest interfaces. It's just a joy to work with. There are some issues. There are some things in Lumion that still don't technically have an undo button. You kind of have to manually delete certain things. And that is, it's an odd thing, especially considering the Lumion engine that Act3D uses was completely revamped and rewritten from scratch for 2023. So, yeah, that's odd. Anyway, all in all, just a joyous interface to work with. It's really a pleasure to work with the interface in Lumion. The D5 interface is relatively streamlined. You can kind of see we've got a large working area in the center. On the left, we have various placement for cameras or stored scenes. Please note, these scenes can have different lighting and weather conditions, very much like stored cameras in Twinmotion or in Lumion. It's kind of the same concept. We do have layers over here on the left for visibility. We've got effectively our scene tree or object panel on the left. And then on the right, we have pretty much our lighting tabs and really sort of some effect tabs where you can adjust light and shadow and things like that. It's a relatively minimal interface. If anything, there are just a few issues with it. Some of the iconography is just a little bit small. It's not a major complaint, not a big issue. And it is a very straightforward interface for new users, which does matter quite a bit in terms of getting people onboarded and sort of ramped up and using your program. And I think it works quite well in the case of D5. Again, they've gone for a much darker interface, which makes things a little bit easier on the eyes. Although I do think the sort of almost gray navy color probably could be made darker still. That would help a little bit. One thing that's sort of interesting about the D5 interface is when the program first came out in its earlier iterations, it had a lot less stuff, which meant that the interface was even more streamlined than it actually is now. So sort of paradoxically, as the program has sort of become more successful and more features have been added, the interface has gotten kind of worse in terms of it's cluttered. There's icons now a little bit all over the place. Some of them you might kind of struggle initially to figure out what exactly they do, and some functionality might be hidden behind things like right-click menus. So if we take a look at like object control over here, like these area lights, I can right-click, and you can see a lot of the sort of options are sort of hidden under a right-click menu. And then again, over here on the right-hand side, you can see we've just got a lot of different buttons and icons. Now, I'm not going to say this is difficult to get to grips with. It's not. It's just sort of, again, sort of interesting that as the program has become more successful, as more features are added, the interface has become a little bit more cluttered. When it comes to working in Twinmotion, there are three sort of systems that we can utilize. There is the standard global illumination model. This is a more traditional raster style rendering engine, and this is the default, if you will, the older sort of way of working in Twinmotion. Still capable of producing some pretty lovely images under the right circumstances, but for many people, we'll be moving on to really use the path tracer and Lumen. The second way that you can work, and this is true of the most recent versions of Twinmotion, is the use of Lumen. It was introduced in Unreal Engine 5 and has been sort of integrated within Twinmotion. This is a little bit possible because Twinmotion is built on the architecture of the Unreal Engine. And so there is a sort of cross-pollination, especially as they're both owned by Epic. Lumen is basically best thought of in its most simplest way as single ray, single bounce global illumination. It allows for far more realistic depiction of shadows and light and materials. And you can see the difference here going from standard over to Lumen. Effectively, how it handles shadows and lighting in particular is really, really superb. The third and final way that we can work within Twinmotion is the use of the path tracer. Now, you might be wondering, path and ray tracing are ostensibly the same thing. There is a technical difference for those of you who are very, very technical, but for most of us, we don't need to necessarily dive into that. And the path tracer is effectively a ray tracing. Now, the path tracer in Twinmotion is a little bit older than Lumion, came in a few years ago at this point. But for still images, the path tracer in Twinmotion is still the best way to go. Now, we'll talk about the hardware requirements for this in a moment, but generally speaking, if you're using Twinmotion, especially the more recent versions of Twinmotion, the path tracer provides a means to access ray-traced renders within Twinmotion itself. All in all, though, the path tracer is an absolutely stunning addition to Twinmotion, and is really the thing that, for a little bit of time there, kept Twinmotion from falling behind the competition. Please note that, we'll mention this a little bit later on, but when it comes to video, you cannot realistically use the path tracer in Twinmotion for video. You can with some workarounds, but it's strongly not recommended, and Lumion will be the fallback for video. There are currently two render modes within Lumion, as we've already stated. The first is the raster render mode. And so the workflow here is going to be pretty familiar to anyone who's used any of these real-time engines. You create your model, whatever it is, send it over to Lumion, and then use Lumion both as your set decoration, your context builder, your environment builder, and then set up your renders. Now, Lumion works in a very interesting fashion. If we pop over here to the actual, let's go to the render mode here, and I'll show you here. This is just basically the default, what you'll get initially. So how traditional rendering works in Lumion is kind of interesting. You don't adjust a lot of the settings in the build mode. That stays almost as its own separate state. You might set up cameras and, put your foliage and put some set decoration. But for the most part, rendering, the process of setting up your rendered shot, will be done in effectively this photo mode. And it works in a very interesting fashion. You effectively choose FX, so special effects, if you will, and you stack them on top of each other. So for example, if we wanted to, let's just go really, really quickly here. So for example, if we wanted to put 2-point perspective on it, we could just click that on, and you can see that there'll be effectively a module that sits at the top of this FX stack. It's an interesting and very artistic workflow. You can see here that if I click on photo 1, you can get a particularly nice look with some of these. This has got quite a number of different effects stacked, and you can actually get away with doing a lot by just keeping the same effects stack and just changing, for example, the real sky. Now, my argument in the last video that I did of this and of this video is that when it comes to exterior rendering, Lumion has, to my mind, just been one of the absolute best. Its handling of light, particularly its skylight effect. This is not global illumination. This is just sort of ambient light within the scene. Just gives an absolutely stunning look to renders. Now, this has been enhanced as of 2023, and I suspect they've kept that from 2024. In other words, if you're just using Lumion for raster renders without even using the ray tracing component, exterior renderings are just absolutely stunning. In fact, if you were just doing, for example, landscape architecture and purely exteriors, then you could still be working in Lumion 12.5 and be getting pretty amazing results. Although I would probably recommend at this point, jump forward to 2024. One other thing to point out about this is this approach to rendering is very much an artistic approach to rendering. It is not photorealistic. You can approximate photorealism, and having used both for projects, Lumion's raster engine, I think, is still much, much better than Twinmotion. I very much struggle to get good exterior renders with Twinmotion for building exterior shots, but it's much easier with Lumion. The second method of rendering with Lumion 23 and 24, well, I'll stick to 24, is the use of the ray tracing system. And the best way you can kind of interpret this to my mind is to picture it as a module that just sort of sits on top of your render stack. You can go up here to custom style and just load up one of the nice little sort of defaults that they've created for you. All you gotta do is pick ray tracing day and let it go to town. Now, you'll notice a couple of things about this. Very similar to using the Twinmotion path tracer, there is a time delay or lag. In other words, the image has to effectively render and denoise before it presents the finished image. Now, we should also point out, you can't always talk about the ray tracing in Lumion 24 without mentioning 23. And I want to hold off on criticisms of 23 till the end, but suffice it to say, if you found the ray tracing in 23 to be particularly bad, splotchy, slow, problematic, it has become substantially better in Lumion 2024. It does, at least from my test runs, appear to be much faster. It's better at being less splotchy, and overall, it just works. I can't even go to describe it. 23, it deboots. That's kind of me being a polite way to put that. In 2024, it just works, and it works really well. And if an interior shot, for example, in Lumion that looked just kind of okay in the past, with the ray tracing module sitting on top, things just look really good, and you have a lot more control. Ray tracing is effectively sort of an on or off thing. We also have some options for adjusting fireflies to try and remove fireflies, and also to make sure that ray traced glass is on. And so if I just pop forward here a little bit and just look at this little kind of glass pampas, and then we turn on the ray traced glass, you can kind of see Lumion will do a much better job rendering glass accurately on the inside. All in all, ray tracing in 2024 in Lumion is now a viable way to render your scenes, and it still works with a lot of the other options. So you can add your own custom real sky or HRI sky, and you can also make changes to your camera. When it comes to rendering in D5, more than the other programs that we've talked about, D5 is very much a what you see is what you actually get. The gap between your viewport performance and the actual final output is probably the least of all of the programs. You'll notice here, if we take a look, if I just, for example, go for my environment tab and I just kind of move my sun around, you can see the changes are being done in pretty much real time. Light is being calculated. You can really see that on the glass, the reflections over here. You can see how that is actually being affected in real time based on the location of the light source. It's really very, very impressive technology. And D5 in its earlier iterations seemed to very much sort of pull on the Lumen approach from Twinmotion, which is single ray, single bounce. But I do think in the more recent versions, that has been improved. And I think it uses probably more bounces per ray of light. At least that's my layman's explanation. Now, in terms of render modes, because it is a what you see is what you get, quite simply, however you set up your viewport, what you have in the viewport, once you actually go to render out an image, the only things you'll really be changing are effectively things like the focal length or the image resolution, so 246 and upwards K, and also whether you want to export out your actual render passes or ID layers, whatever you want to call them. But that's about it. However it looks in the viewport is pretty much akin to what you're going to get. And in fact, they've recently improved the viewport sort of look for video as well. So now video that is rendered out of D5 will also look more akin to what you see in the viewport. It's quite impressive technology. Twinmotion does come with a limited selection. We have trees, and to the best of my knowledge, these haven't really been sort of either updated or kind of added to in quite a while. By all accounts, it's a limited selection, although the selection is pretty good. So for example, if we're looking for Scandinavian or Nordic trees, we do have access to those. We can also do pretty good if we're trying to look for maybe North American trees. things like oak or spruce. By all accounts, even though these Twinmotion trees do have a number of cool features, for example, you can actually adjust their age, their height, you can adjust the season, and you can also adjust how much wind affects them, it's still at its most, generous. It's a basic library of trees. And if you're looking to use Twinmotion primarily for landscape architecture or landscape design, you're going to find the native trees really, really limiting. There's also tabs for bushes. And again, this is a nice but slightly dated looking selection. And we've also got some really nice weeds and grasses. Of the software we're looking at today, it is probably the worst foliage library. You can do really good things with it, and the grass tends to look good, whether you're using the sort of raster engine or Lumion, and even the path tracer. However, it is a small library. Now, this brings us to what you could argue is an extension of the library. One of the best benefits of using Twinmotion is access to the Quixel Megascans library. The Megascans library is continually being updated, and again, Quixel is now effectively owned by Epic, so it's all part of one giant ecosystem, which at some point, I think either this year or maybe early next year, will be rebranded. This will all be a part of the new ecosystem for Unreal, which is basically Quixel becoming Fab. Now, you can see here, should be coming out sometime in 2024, hopefully with a cooler and better name than Fab. Anyway, moving on. Now, here's the thing. The Quixel Megascans library is integrated within Twinmotion. You have access to thousands of surfaces and materials. You also have access to 3D assets, including nature assets and landscape assets. This is quite simply a really big boon to Twinmotion. You no longer necessarily have to look for exterior models, particularly landscape models, or for exterior surfaces. You can get materials or surfaces, whatever terminology you want to use, directly within Twinmotion, downloading them from the Quixel Megascans library. This opens up whole new pathways for materials and just for, again, the complexity and sort of fidelity of your scenes. When it comes to the internal library for Lumion, it's a little bit of a mixed bag. There are areas where it absolutely excels and areas that still need work. The primary area where Lumion is in many ways just ahead of the curve is something that's been doing really well for years, is foliage. Now, the foliage library in Lumion is very, very vast. You can see here we've got options for broadleaf, conifers, palm trees, leafless trees, grasses. It goes on and on and on. Quite simply, if you need a particular type of foliage, there's a very good chance that you're going to find it in the library. In addition, we also have fine detail plants, which are basically hyper-realistic plants. You can see they've got that little EverMotion tag here, so you can kind of identify where they actually came from. And some of the other plants, objects will have that as well. You can see the fine detailed plants and the fine detailed trees are really, really very impressive. Now, they may be substantially high poly with pretty heavy texture maps, but the actual fidelity of these is really, really nice. On top of that, we've got a lot of weeds, rocks, and kind of twigs and branches and leaves and things like that. Basically, we've got a ton of foliage. So if you're building an environment, you're building your scene, you'll be able to build a somewhat really good facsimile of a particular environment, whether it's a desert or, coastal or, evergreen forest. It doesn't really matter. You should be able to build a viable environment using just the Lumion foliage. It's really very, very good. And with the update in 2024, the foliage now supports ray tracing, so it should look a lot better when you turn on the ray tracing module for exterior shots. For a lot of users, the foliage that comes with your real-time rendering engine can actually go a long way to making or breaking your renders, especially if you do a lot of commercial projects. you need a diverse range of trees and foliage and plants and grass, and you need to be able to scatter or place them quickly. Now, again, the D5 foliage library is going to be held on the cloud. It is available under the Nature tab under the Asset Library. And you can see we have about 3,840 nature assets. That's a very staggering amount, and they're all arranged in a logical order. Thumbnails can be adjusted to be small, medium, and large, so just kind of like Lumion. You can see pretty quickly what objects you're working with. And a couple of things to notice about this. D5 does come also with some low resolution trees and foliage. And I say low because they're lower, but they're not necessarily completely low poly. You can kind of see here, you look at these two trees. One is technically lower, the other one is not. But again, it's really nice to have the option. You can decorate an entire scene here using just these lower poly trees and probably really help your performance at that too. Now, the other thing to note, we also have a couple of more interactive tools as well. We do have the ability to lay down procedurally generated vines, which is very, very interesting. And we have a wide array of different ornamental grasses and shrubs. Quite simply, there's a lot in the D5 foliage library. And I think really the only competitor of the software we're looking at today is going to be Lumion. Although, as we mentioned, some of the Lumion models have not aged well. Some of their flowering plants in particular don't look great. And the D5 foliage library is newer and just that bit better and sharper. One other really cool feature about the D5 foliage library is that the plants are named by their scientific name as opposed to some localized name, which I think is actually a very clever system. So if you're looking for something in particular, like we'll just do like an Acer, all you have to do is type it in. Now, the object library is going to be a big deal for all of these softwares. So let's take a look at the Twinmotion library. We have under the Objects tab, quite a different number of different brackets. We have objects for home and for living room. We have newer objects for city, everything from bollards to benches to trash cans. The idea being here that you have all the objects you need to decorate your renders. The Home tab also comes with a number of decorative objects that can be really nice for adding to your scene. And recently, Twinmotion, the Epic, or the developers of Twinmotion, if you will, have been putting a lot more emphasis on adding new objects to this. So we can see there's a lot more new objects, for example, under the Backyard tab. And some of these I found to be very, very useful. Having access to these, they just make your sort of commercial, what I do, kind of a lot of home renders, just look a lot better. They just look more lived in, more realistic. There's also been an increased push for more specialized objects. Healthcare and gym equipment in particular have seen kind of an uptick. One area where Twinmotion falls short, and this is literally the complaint I had when I made this video last year, when it comes to internal decoration. Let's take a look, for example, at the living room decorations. They have added quite a number of new ones. Artwork has seen an uptick. The number of books and just general objects, these are pretty nice all in all. They're great in a pinch. There's a lot of great books, which are really, really great. You can't ever have enough books in interior scenes. They just make the place, again, just look lived in and alive. But when it comes to decoration, this, it's an okay-ish library of things. I'm not going to say it's great. It isn't. They're functional. When you consider the amount of effort that was recently put into, for example, adding all of these musical instruments, which is very cool, and these models are brilliant, you do kind of wonder how many users are actually decorating their interior shots with musical instruments. I don't think it's actually that many. I do think Twinmotion may have been better spent building more generic objects. And this is something we'll talk about when we talk about people. Actually just purchasing a library of pre-made objects and having them come with Twinmotion. So if you're using Twinmotion for exterior shots, great. You probably won't have to worry that much. If you're using Twinmotion for interiors, so interior decoration or interior architecture or just showing off the rooms of an interior build, you're probably going to have to get your decorative objects from somewhere else. Because Lumion is somewhat of an older program at this stage, it's been around, God, for I don't know how many years now, since the early 2000s, I think. You do have some issues with some of the models. There is a default library, and remember, we said that when you're using a real-time engine, one of the benefits is that it's all in one. It should have everything you need, including decorative objects. And in some ways, Lumion does this quite well. In some ways, it doesn't. There are quite a number of different objects. For example, the garden tab, we've got some nice looking things that you could place in your scene. And then we've got a lot of other sort of objects. Food and drink, it does quite well within a limited paradigm. You have a certain number of food and drink, they look good. But other things like decorative elements, some of these have not aged well. And I don't mean that they were inherently bad. They just no longer have the fidelity or sharpness or detail. Or in the case of some of the decorative objects, they're just sort of out of style. They've kind of fallen a little bit out of style. And so, you know, this is something, an area of improvement. Now, you can narrow down your search. So for example, I can search by 2023, and this will tell you these were the objects that were added last year. There's some really nice stuff in here. Lumion has been, at least in the last few years, kind of improving the objects and the standard of the objects that come in the library. And some things are definitely looking a lot better. Not entirely sure why you need this bottle, but yeah, there you go. And we can also type in just 24 to look for more up-to-date models as well. And you can see we've got some newer models. They have been adding more and more stuff. We've got more gym models and I think medical models as well. But the issue remains that some of the decorative elements are just kind of old and they just no longer really look very good. Because you can tell that some of these like come from like Evermotion or Maxtree and things like that, it would almost, I would argue, behoove Lumion to really just maybe just outsource this a little bit. There's nothing wrong, I think, with buying a library of pre-existing content. For example, the Blender Marketplace has tons of really, really good objects, relatively affordable. There's a lot of groups and organizations that make libraries of content. Now, I'm not saying it would be cheap to do this, but it would be one way to massively improve the standard and scale of the actual library. For the most part, there's enough stuff here for you to be able to just add, you know, basic books and pictures and stuff like that. But much like Twinmotion, if you're really wanting to do interior shots and to have them decorated to a high standard, you're going to probably have to look elsewhere for more of the more modern stuff, particularly modern artwork or modern decorative elements. Now, when it comes to urban environments like cityscapes and things like that, you do have quite a number of buildings that you can call on. Because Act 3D is European, a lot of the buildings do have a very European flavor. I do, however, again, think that we could probably do with maybe updating these. These have been the same sort of buildings that, you know, my students were using years ago, and they're still kind of using it at this point. You know, it would be nice to have a few more objects, maybe some from Asia or North America, just other parts of the world, or just some variation in the actual design. These will do fine if they're just outside of the building that you're working on. But if you're actually going to see a street, like a proper street, it would be nice to have more buildings to work with. You do get some really nice street decorations, though, that you can actually place in your scene, and those will look pretty good for the most part. One thing I do also want to mention, vehicles in Lumion are actually really, really cool. They do have some nice little settings, and the models are generally pretty good for these. I'm just going to place this sort of very ugly sedan-looking thing here. And we just spin around here. You can kind of see we've got some nice options. We can toggle the driver, we can toggle lights, and we can toggle metallic paint. We can also put in custom license plates, which is really, really, it's a small thing, but I do think it is appreciated if you do sort of like commercial renders and you want the vehicles in those to look a little bit better. The car paint in particular and the lights is really, really cool. One of the most impressive features of D5 is its asset library. Now, unlike a lot of the others, Twinmotion comes with some assets that are pre-built in and some you download. Lumion, they're effectively all being a part of the sort of download and you install them all at the same time. D5, the asset library, is actually held in the cloud, so hitting M on the keyboard will bring up this window, which gives you access to all of the available models. Now, you can see here, the D5 asset library is incredibly large, and it's also of an incredibly high quality. Unlike some of the models that come with Twinmotion or Lumion, the D5 asset library, the models seem to be a lot newer. This is really noticeable. If we, for example, go out of the Nature tab and we just go into Indoor and we look at accessories and just the ornaments, the selection of decorative elements for people doing interior renders is absolutely stunning. It's very vast. The models are of really high quality. They look good. They're newer, and in many ways, they just look better. Now, I'm not necessarily saying they look better because of D5's ray trace or anything like that. They're just of a higher fidelity, and that's just a great boon for D5 users. Now, a couple of other things to notice about this. One issue with placing your library in the cloud is that, unfortunately, your ability to use these is partially dependent on geographic location and access to internet speeds. So in other words, if you're in an area where there's not a local server nearby, it could be a little bit problematic. The other thing is, it can become a little bit frustrating constantly having to re-download the same model again and again and again every time you use it in an actual different scene. Thing to note about the D5 asset library is it does seem to be relatively continuously updated. It seems that every time D5 has a point increase, in other words, going from 2.4 to 2.5 or 5.6, new assets are added to the library. And as we mentioned, they tend to have a really high quality. And D5 seems to be very good at listening to its user base when they make requests for specific things. So, for example, we've got really good office equipment, but recently they've also added in more medical equipment and musical equipment. Again, your use case may vary a little bit by this. I mean, I really don't know how many times people are actually going to be adding drum sets, to their scenes, but there you go. All in all, the models are, however, really, really good. If you do a lot of interior design, interior decorating, or interior architecture, then these models make literally set dressing your scenes really easy and actually really enjoyable. If you've made it to this point in the video, I just wanted to take a moment to say thank you so much for watching. Really, really do appreciate it. And really do appreciate those of you who have subscribed. The VRender channel is at almost 4,000 subscribers now, and with many thousands more who watched the video. So thank you all so much. I really do appreciate it. And I really appreciate people taking time to write stuff in the comments, even if it's just a technical question. It's really great to be able to talk about this stuff with other people. It's really great. Thank you so much. And I did want to take a quick moment just to thank a number of people, and specifically here, these were the first 10 subscribers who ever subscribed to the channel. So thank you so much for doing that. Just really great. Appreciate it, going all the way back to, 2 years ago. Thank you so much. I also want to take a moment just to thank user Quasi Cortez, who wrote a absolutely incredible and very detailed technical analysis on the lighting in Twinmotion. It was incredibly informative, and hopefully I can make a video on this, sharing some of this knowledge. Really great. Really great schooling. Thank you so much. Twinmotion does come with a library of animated humans. Let's go ahead and just download these. Let's take a quick look really quickly. There's a couple of things that are really interesting about these, and I think are of benefit. The first is that the Twinmotion figures do tend to be animated. Not exclusively. There are other non-animation, just posed figures, and there's generally kind of, I think, a bit more of these. You can see these are just static meshes. This is a great thing to have in your scenes, and if you're doing, for example, commercial renders, you probably do need people in your shot. The big issue when it comes to the Twinmotion people is not that they're not really malleable. They are. You can see, you can change the cloth, you can also change what the characters are actually doing. to some degree. Some of them come with some really, really interesting choices for what they're actually doing. But the issue is primarily, that's some really bad dancing. The issue is primarily something to do with the fidelity of the characters. The Twinmotion animated figures quite simply no longer look good, and this is true whether you're using the standard version of Twinmotion, whether you're using Lumion, or the path tracer. Quite simply, they look old and they look dated, and they haven't been given the TLC that they generally need to. When these characters are stationary, if they're not moving, you can actually see the jagged edges. Quite simply, you can see how the mesh is actually constructed. And you can see this particularly on the shoulders here. These harsh lines are basically the result of a low poly model, or in this case, probably a low poly scan with a texture map baked on. Again, if you're doing commercial property renders and you just need people in the background, you can get away with using these figures if they're far away, if they're not looking at the camera, if they're not playing the piano or dancing in a terribly bad fashion. You can absolutely use them. But for anything involving figures up close, the Twinmotion posed or animatable humans do not look good. Firstly, I would argue these models are a little bit better than those in Twinmotion. You don't actually see as much the polygonal sort of shaping of the characters. There are a couple of issues still with them. They have a very rubber feel, and I don't know if this is just to do with really the level of texture mapping or material work on them. I believe they are probably 3D scans that have been maybe cleaned up, but they do have a slight rubber feel. As with most of these 3D people, though, you really shouldn't be putting these close to the camera. And while I'd feel a little better with some of these models, there are some that I think just still haven't really aged very well. Let's take a look at this woman here on the bike. I'll give you an example of what I mean. Yeah, you can see here the sort of the hair just honestly just doesn't look good, and the distinct lack of blinking. So they're good-ish. Keep them away from the camera and keep them moving away from the camera. Now, the second major issue when it comes to Lumion and their sort of, if you will, their library of people and animals, really just comes down to one simple thing, is pets. We've got animals here, but we've only got 3 dogs. Put in more dogs. People love dogs. They give kind of a warmth and niceness to your renders, and they make homes just look good. We could probably do with less pigeons and more dogs. That is very much just my opinion. Anyway, moving on. D5 does a pretty good job with this. You can see here, if we look at some of these characters, the overall fidelity of these characters, I think, is a little bit better, definitely better than the older ones in Twinmotion. You don't get as much of the jagged polygonal effect. It's still there. You kind of notice it around the hair a little bit. But for the most part, these characters look better. I think the skin in particular does look a little bit better. Obviously, they all still come with that weird, freaky lack of blinking and the uncanny valley-esque effect. But they are, I think, a lot newer than the other people models. The D5 collection of people also features a couple of really interesting things. We've got a lot better options for the genre, if you will, of people. So business, casual, sports and fitness, things like that. We've got a good selection of regional people, and we've got a large selection of sort of construction and professionals. It's kind of nice to have them sort of grouped into this. We do also have 2D people as well, if you want to use cutouts, just like the other programs as well. And again, one major feature of these is that in D5, you also have a larger range of sort of diversity of people. You have different ages and different ethnicities. So quite simply, when it comes to building a scene with people, you can do pretty well in D5. Yeah, D5 is probably, I would argue, got the best library of people. They're not perfect. They still have that weird dead-eye look a little bit, and their movement is still, in some cases, just a little bit too In terms of animation, it's just a little bit too mechanical, and it's good. It's just not there yet. When it comes to the rapid placement of objects, particularly landscape objects, Twinmotion, especially the newer versions, have got some really great means to do that. The newer versions of Twinmotion come with a line spacing tool and area tools, on top of the ability to paint trees and foliage and grass in. This allows for more artistic and more organic placing of objects. And generally speaking, these tools work really, really well. You can build up pretty natural environments pretty quickly, and all in all, they'll work a lot better than placing these objects by hand. We have options for single placement, line, cluster, and also paint placement. Now, the most useful of all of these, I think, is going to be the line placement. It's pretty simple. You just draw a line from start to finish. Really great. It's easy to just add foliage or trees or whatever object you want arranged along the line. And then we can also adjust the number, the direction, but most importantly is the ability to randomize the offset and randomize spacing along the line. This will effectively give the placement of objects, usually going to be landscaped like trees and things like that, a much more organic appearance. It will look better than if you try to do this by hand. These tools in Lumion are very, very fast. They're quite responsive and they're quite easy to work with. We do have things like cluster placement as well, but generally the placement along a line tool in Lumion is really very, very good. We've got a path tool for characters, vehicles, and animals, and we also have a number of means to paint in foliage using the paintbrush, scatter, or path tool. Now, one of the really cool ones I like using is actually the brush tool for D5. It's pretty easy to work with. All we have to do is go down and pick up the actual, let's just do some of these low resolution trees. And you can see all I have to do is just click on the ones that are being added right here at the center. And once we have that in place, we can just adjust our brush radius and just start painting in our foliage. It works very, very well. It's quite quick and quite snappy. The only caveat with this is because it's very easy to actually paint in foliage in D5, you do have to be very mindful of the poly count within your actual scenes. But all in all, the sort of scatter and line tools in D5, like the other programs, it's something they all do quite well. You'll have no issues building up the context, especially the foliage context, for your scenes in D5. Our default lighting environment is pretty good. We've got a natural lighting setup using a time of day. We've got quite a number of different sliders to adjust the actual light itself. On top of that, Twinmotion comes with a pretty robust and quite visually appealing weather system, which will allow you to adjust things like time of day and seasons. And the newer versions of Twinmotion will allow you to apply seasonal effects to imported foliage, which is something you were not able to do before. Additionally, Twinmotion also has rain and fog and snow procedural effects. For more advanced lighting, we can actually use HDRI lighting environments. And you can see here, Twinmotion comes with quite a wide array of them. Different times of day, different atmospheric conditions, different levels of clouds, and different mood. Adjusting the lighting in Twinmotion is as easy as downloading the HDRI that you want and just dragging it into your actual scene. And these HDRIs are really quite good. They can be assigned as a sky dome or effectively projected as an entire background in order to light your scene. Twinmotion has one of the best selections of HDRI skies at the moment, and it's working with Twinmotion's lighting is generally pretty joyous. It's a really good experience, and you can see the results pretty quickly. You can drop in your HDRIs into the sky dome setting or into the backdrop HDRI, and the backdrop HDRI will actually give you more options for effectively positioning your sky. You can use a default sort of more traditional sun and moon kind of system. And that's pretty basic. Or you can use the much better real skies. Now, Lumion comes with a whole load of real skies. And you can see here, we can load them up. We've got quite a number of options. And these do come from Polygon. You can see that right here. But they are generally very, very good. In fact, these real skies, in my experience, have been so good that I kind of wish I was able to use them in other projects. One issue with them, though, was that the supply is sort of limited. You only have so many kind of clear skies or cloudy skies. And while you have a good selection, you may find yourself looking for something different or hitting limitations. Now, recently, though, as of, I think, 2024, you can now load up your own custom HDRI skies. So literally, there's no barrier to how to light your scene in Lumion, which is really good. Like I said, the selection that it comes with is very good. You know, you'll probably use them without any problems. I think it's a really good system, and the way they light your actual scene is very, very good. Just like the default lighting within Twinmotion or Lumion. Quite simply, it's got a sun in the sky that you can move, rotate, put at specific times of day. There's some other fun stuff you can do with this in terms of the weather, adding fog and clouds into this mix as well. And all in all, the D5, because of the ray tracing element of D5, the Geo and Sky is a perfectly adequate way of lighting your scenes. In other words, you don't necessarily have to rely on a HDRI or a real sky or something like that to light up your scene to get it to look realistic or good. Because of the way light bounces around sort of correctly, and just because of the way shadows are handled, the D5 Geo and Sky is still a pretty good way to light your scenes. And for a lot of scenes, it's my preferred way. You don't have to worry about HDRI, just get the sun going the way you want, determine how hard you want the shadows to be, and things like that. The second option is the use of a high dynamic range image, which is not new to anybody at this stage, just a HDRI sky. Now, D5 comes with a small bunch of these, not a huge amount built in by default, and certainly not the massive array of HDRI skies that you get with Twinmotion, which has a very vast library, or the sort of consistent Lumion ones that have been sort of the same for the last few years. So one remedy for this is a couple of things. You can now download HDRI skies from the D5 asset library. You can see we click on these, we've got access to, right now it says 39. I can only imagine that this library is going to grow and grow and grow. You do have slightly less options when working with the Geo and Sky in terms of the position of the actual HDRI. Unlike in Twinmotion, we can't entirely wrap it around. It acts effectively like a sky dome. So in other words, the HDRI is going to sit right up here and just cast light sort of evenly around the scene. This is a known limitation of D5, is that you pick your HDRI and you can make some changes to it, but you don't have all the changes that you'll get in some of the other programs. Now, in saying that, the lighting within D5 is absolutely stellar. Because it is ray traced out of the box, you don't have to necessarily set up shadows or worry about shadow bias or anything like that, or adjust sort of some of the other settings that you might have to do in Lumion or Twinmotion. You quite simply just pick your sky and see how it looks. The other thing to note about this is D5's push for AI tools and integrating them in a very clever manner has meant that you can use AI tools to sample the lighting from another image, which is also really, really clever. It's not perfect, but it is working, and it is quite impressive technology. In addition to that, you can also now download other people's lighting environments, which is a real boon. It has led to what I mentioned in another video is basically a sort of sameness, but it's really cool to be able to download someone else's entire lighting setup and actually just have a look at what they did and how they did it. You can use it if you want or change it. Twinmotion uses a pretty conventional PBR workflow. It uses a roughness metallic workflow, so there's not a specular workflow component. We have options for a couple of different things here. Default color maps, We can load up roughness, metallic, normal, and recently ambient occlusion and emissive maps as well. And if you've used any 3D program recently over the last while, the idea of the PBR workflow should be pretty familiar to you. Now, we also have options for opacity and X-ray effects, although you're less likely to be using them if you're using architectural rendering. A couple of things to note though. As it currently stands, Twinmotion has very limited options for projection mapping. We have about 4 ways to project materials onto a surface, and we do lack some of the newer features. For example, we have no way in Twinmotion to use forms of triplanar mapping, and seams are a bit of an issue. Quite simply, if your object is not flat or UV unwrapped, you may run into some issues with how materials are projected in Twinmotion, and having cubic and spherical, that will only get you so far up until you run into a UV mapping issue. When it comes to working with materials in Lumion, it's a pretty good system, albeit sometimes slightly sluggish in its response. If we double click on this table right here, you can see we have a full PBR setup using a roughness and metalness workflow. So we don't really necessarily have a specular workflow. It is the more commonly accepted metal and roughness workflow. You can see we've got slots for our actual texture map, which should technically be the albedo, not the, diffuse and albedo are kind of used interchangeably, but for the most part, you're talking about an actual color map, which is going to be the albedo. So we've got a slot here for that. We can adjust that. We can also adjust the overall color, and we've got options for the scale. We also have normal map slot, roughness, reflectivity, and metalness. We actually have quite a bit of control in Lumion over the look and feel of our materials. There are some things that we're kind of missing. We don't have an ambient occlusion slot, and there is no sort of specular slot, even if you particularly wanted to use that. Now, we also have a number of really good features when working with materials here as well. We can adjust the opacity, we can also load opacity maps, and we can load displacement. Now, Lumion does do a good job using faux or sort of fake displacement. And unlike D5, it does seem to handle displacement on flat surfaces a lot better. You can get a very good look to the materials within Lumion. We do also have options recently for subsurface scattering if you want to make materials where light travels through them. For example, this lampshade up here, or something made of wax, or maybe fine metals that do allow the transfer of light. In addition, we also have some other options for materials to increase the fidelity. We have one of the most important sliders, which is the ability to soften edges, which is really very good if you're coming from certain softwares. For example, SketchUp, where you don't really have a bevel function. The soften edges will really increase the detail in terms of like how objects kind of get a little highlight around the edges, which is more realistic. And this soften slider will allow you to do that without having to really increase the density of the geometry of your object, which is really very, very nice. It is something that Twinmotion is lacking and has been lacking for quite a while. We can also add this clear coat effect, which will make objects look as if they have a layer of sort of gloss or varnish if they're a finished material. These are small things, but they do actually really matter, especially if, for example, you do a lot of kitchen interior rendering. You're going to need these smoothed edges, or if you're using bathroom renders as well, and you might need that clear coat because a lot of sort of plastic laminated objects have a sheen to them, and so these sliders are really good. We also have procedural foliage if you want to add those, and then lastly we have sort of options for UVs. Now, Lumion as well does not have an ability to do triplanar projections or to change the projection type, which can be somewhat problematic. However, it does seem to do a very good job of projecting imported materials onto objects. I'm not sure exactly what it's doing under the hood, but it seems to handle how materials are projected onto objects quite well. Like the other programs, they all use a version of the base PBR or physically based rendering workflow. Now, if we look over here on the right where we've got the map slot, you can see that we've got base color map. The base color map is effectively going to be your albedo. We've got a normal. We have the roughness and AO channels and a metallic. Now, interestingly enough, D5 also features a specular channel, which to the best of my knowledge is not strictly speaking accurate if you're using a roughness metallic workflow, but nevertheless, it is there for materials that you may want to have a particular specular highlight on. Now, we also have a couple of other really important things. The two things that we have that are the most important is the triplanar projection, which is something that the other software do not yet feature, which means if you have objects that do not have UVs and the texture mapping, for example, a concrete material applied in D5 doesn't look right, you can actually just turn on the triplanar button and have D5 effectively project that in a smarter, better way. This to me is just a massive, massive thing, because it means you're no longer constrained by some of the more traditional workflow. More specifically, you don't have to necessarily learn to UV unwrap, although you should, but you don't have to anymore. You can get away without doing that if you work with D5. This is a big deal for those of us who are coming maybe from SketchUp or other programs that don't feature UV unwrapping by default. Now, the second thing that's really, really important is the round corner feature. This is something that Lumion also has, and it's brilliant. It allows you to be able to go in and effectively adjust the edges and corners. You can see this table has got a pretty sharp edge here. So I'm going to click on that, turn on the round corner option, and you can see now I can actually adjust the sharpness of the round corner. If again, you come from a workflow that doesn't allow you to do easy bevels or easy subdivisions, then again, the triplanar and round corner buttons really will help quite a bit improve the quality of your renders. And I do think it is one of the big limitations of Twinmotion right now is that you don't have options for either of those things, and I really wish that they would fix that. One other thing to note about materials in D5, materials themselves, there are a lot. Again, they are going to be held in the asset library, which is cloud-based. So even if you love a particular material, you're still going to have to get in the habit of clicking on it and downloading it. Now, material download speeds, at least for me, have been very, very fast. I have encountered a few issues where the materials just do not download, or it'll pop up with some little error message, but that is kind of rare and very kind of not that common. But we do have a huge amount. You can also obviously import your own without any real issues, and you can save imported materials and models to your local library. One really interesting thing about this is the wood materials. I do think they're very, very good in D5. We've got wood grain, and we have a separate tab for wood flooring, which is one of the issues sort of with, I think, to some degree, both Lumion and Twinmotion. You need wood flooring. It's used in pretty much every commercial render that I've ever done. They all have wood floors or some sort of wood floor laminate. And so you can't ever have enough wood flooring materials. So just something to keep in mind. When it comes to handling your images and video, Twinmotion is generally pretty easy to work with. There's a dedicated media tab that will allow you to set up your still renders, panorama, and video. And the controls for video in particular are relatively straightforward. There's nothing particularly sort of complicated about it. If you're used to setting up basically a keyframe shot and then moving to another keyframe shot, you'll find it quite easy to work with. We did, however, mention earlier on that if you plan on using Twinmotion for video, you're for the most part going to be limited to using just the standard raster engine, the older traditional engine, or Lumen, which means you need to get very comfortable with the settings for Lumen, and they are relatively unique-ish settings. Rendering video with the path tracer is effectively not a viable option for most of us. Working with media, still images, is very, very easy within Twinmotion. Each image can have its own environment settings, its own lighting settings, and it's actually pretty simple to adjust all of these on a per shot basis. In terms of speed and export size, Twinmotion can handle up to about 8K reasonably, and speeds for 4 and 8K will be pretty comparable to most other softwares. You can see we've options on the top left for photo, movie, and 360 panoramas. As we've already mentioned, each one is done as its own individual thing where you apply FX stacks on top. Think of each picture or clip as its own separate entity. Working with media, especially for example still images, is going to require a little bit more work, as Lumion does require you to be familiar with a pretty vast array of FXs that can be applied to your shot. Now this will require a bit more work up front to figure out what they do, and there are some that you might kind of struggle a little bit early on to understand what exactly they do or how they work. This has been simplified with the ray tracing module, as that effectively discontinues or turns off many of the FX and only allows you to utilize the ones that will work with ray tracing. You've got a lot of different options for storing different environments. So for example, if you wanted a photo down here with one particular lighting style, and you wanted another one with a completely different one, you can do that too. It's pretty easy to bounce between different stored photos, and it's pretty easy to copy and paste FX from one photo to another. Camera settings are relatively limited. We've got options for focal length, and we do have some really nice aspect ratio buttons that we can play around with if you're trying to get your media into a specific format. Although I would strongly recommend that you just render as big as you can and kind of crop this stuff in Photoshop. Resolution can be determined when you actually hit the giant render button over here, which is going to be this button right here. It used to be green, now it's blue. Yay. You can also set things like the overall quality of your renders. You can put out additional output, which is really important if you're doing still renders. You can export things like depth maps. You can export the material ID map or the clown pass, the sky, and lighting inspector. This is very, very useful if you like doing post-production in Photoshop. Now, in addition, working with video, relatively straightforward. You can see it's an identical system here. You can work on clips or whole movies, and it is actually pretty easy to work with. I can only judge this based on, for example, how readily my students were able to pick this up, and it seems to be they work pretty well. D5 is relatively straightforward. It's easy, for example, to just go up here to the top right, click on image, and you can see again we've got options for camera, focal length, the aspect ratio, and the preset size. It's relatively straightforward. Once you've actually set up the lighting and done all your materials in the D5 viewport, the actual exporting of media is relatively straightforward. The biggest issue is just going to be the actual size you want to render at. And generally speaking, D5's render speed is impeccably fast. Now, when it comes to working with video, pretty similar setup. When it comes to D5, because D5 is ray traced directly out of the box, it actually just renders video extremely efficiently because each video is effectively just made up of still renders put together, basically frames. And so it does this quite well. Obviously, there's some caveats, complexity, scene complexity, polygon or edge count, and things like that, and also what resolution. But if you're doing video rendering, then I know which program I would pick and choose. It's not really a question. I think of the three, it'll be D5. The most priority thing is going to be the graphics card. This is going to be the same for all of the software we talk about, but the requirements for Lumion do seem quite steep. Now, they're pretty upfront about this. Like, what they're basically saying is you need as powerful a GPU as you can possibly get. This is not going to come cheap. Yeah, you can technically run Lumion without using ray tracing, and as such, you don't need an RTX, NVIDIA, or AMD-enabled graphics card, which could keep costs down a little bit, but performance is going to be problematic at that. You'll also need a GPU that has as large a amount of RAM as you can get, and the actual computer also needs a high level of installed RAM. The problem with this is going to be ultimately the cost. Lumion is not, strictly speaking, intended for lower end users, I don't think. And this sort of makes sense if you understand where they're coming from. Lumion is, to my understanding, intended for people, particularly architectural firms or companies, for whom, hardware budgets is not the biggest issue. They will throw money at the problem just to get what they want that has the immediacy and works as fluidly as they need it to work, effectively designing at the speed of thought. They don't want to worry about a sluggish machine or sluggish hardware. And that's sort of understandable, especially if you're in a firm or a large company. A little bit harder to swallow if you're a solo or individual operator or running a small company or doing something like this on the side. Graphics cards are prohibitively expensive at the moment, and that's unlikely to change anytime soon. So if you're building your software effectively on the idea that, hardware, the expense is not as much of an issue as it is, you're going to leave some customers behind, is at least my belief on this. The requirements for Twinmotion are a little bit more variable. We seem to have a minimum and a high. Some software tends to put in a medium requirement here. But realistically, if you are using Twinmotion and you want to get the most from it, you should be looking at the high-end requirements. Now, these can be cost prohibitive because really what it comes down to is hardware, and that means having the best GPU that you can get your hands on. Now, this is definitely true of the software that we're looking at today. There seems to be a sort of a gap, I suspect, between what the developers are effectively working with versus what the majority of the average user is probably using. And just like a lot of these softwares, the requirements do seem to be going up. Now, what this means for a lot of Twinmotion users is if you want to get the best out of Twinmotion, you want a fluid Lumen experience, and you want to be able to use the path tracer, then you do need to invest in a pretty substantial GPU. You can also see here the high-end requirements do ask for 64 gigs of system memory, basically just RAM, which for a lot of people, considering, depending on what you look at and whose data you look at, a lot of people are still using 16 gigs and all the way up to 32. So please keep in mind here, if you want to get the best out of Twinmotion, you are going to have to make a substantial hardware investment, and you're going to have to keep making the hardware investment. There is a silver lining to this though, and that's the price. In what will probably be, to my mind, one of the biggest sort of sea changes, and I'm not going to use the phrase game changer because that gets thrown around all the time, but in terms of a sea change, I do think that the Twinmotion pricing model change is going to have a profound impact on both the architectural visualization field, on product design, on really automotive rendering, all of the things that we mentioned at the start that Twinmotion is sort of slightly pivoting or switching to. And quite simply, it's because the price of free is very, very hard to beat. As of, I think, earlier this year, Twinmotion is now running a free-to-use pricing system. In other words, consistent with sort of like the original Unreal Engine price that was effectively free up until you made a certain amount of money, which I think was about $1 million. Twinmotion is now also free for individuals and businesses as long as you're making less than $1 million in US dollars in revenue per year. Twinmotion has gone from somewhere in the region of like between $400 and $500, I can't remember the exact figure, to nothing. And there seems to be no restrictions on its actual use. You can, to the best of my knowledge, use Twinmotion for commercial projects, as long as you're not making up to $1 million. Now, Twinmotion's price was never exorbitant compared to Lumion, which we'll get to in a second. But switching to free is going to have a profound impact. There were some issues when D5 was first released in terms of the cards that were required to run the software. Ever since, as the developers have pointed out, with new iterations as the program grows, those limitations are, for the most part, kind of gone. You can see on their website they have a pretty vast range of supported GPU hardware. You're not required anymore to run it only on specifically on NVIDIA cards, And other than sort of like, as far as your budget stretches, you really can't get away with running D5 on lower end hardware. We should also point out though, the makers of D5 do recommend requirements for your CPU and the amount of actual RAM on your machine. But quite simply, I've seen stunning artwork done on laptops and I've seen stunning artwork done on desktop computers. But quite simply, D5 has become more egalitarian insofar as more and more people are able to access and use it, which is interesting insofar as you look at the hardware requirements for Lumion and Twinmotion, and they continue to go up and up and up. And as such, so does price goes up. This brings us to the question of pricing. D5 does come with a free community edition, which is really interesting. And you can do quite a lot with the free version. Now, you are limited to the number of materials and the number of assets that are unlocked in the D5 asset library. But for the most part, there's not a huge amount of restrictions to the free version, and you can do professional work on the free version. You also have a pro account, which you can pay for either yearly or monthly. You can see it's a little bit more expensive if you do the monthly. It's about $38 a month, and yearly comes out to about $360. Now, there used to be back in the day a perpetual license of D5. They have gotten rid of that, and it's sort of understandable why. You know, subscription-based licensing really does kind of provide money coming in pretty much every month, and you can understand that. But realistically, $38 a month is not that bad to unlock all the materials, all of the assets, and some of the other small little widgets that are held behind a paywall. So that's pretty impressive, honestly. Now, you can see there's also options for teams and enterprise, but most people who are probably watching this are more interested in the individual account as well. It's hard to talk about price without necessarily comparing it to the other software. So firstly, Twinmotion is free, completely free now to everybody, unless you're making up to $1 million, which is free is very hard to argue with, and there's no restrictions. It's not free with some stuff hidden behind a paywall, it's just completely free. Lumion, however, the $1,500 per year does become a little bit harder to justify versus the $38 a month or $360 a year price for D5 for software that is effectively newer, kind of more lightweight in terms of installation because you're not downloading the entire asset library. It's ray traced just out of the box, can do video seamlessly out of the box. Yeah, it can become a little bit harder to justify the Lumion price tag in comparison to D5's community or pro versions. So, with all that being said, where does that leave us? And here's the part where we need to be more critical and talk about the areas where there's room for improvement within Twinmotion. Now, the first one is going to be pricing. And we're not complaining about the free pricing model at all. This is a very, very smart and canny move on the behalf of Epic. Quite simply, by eliminating the price barrier, what you effectively do is open up Twinmotion to a much, much wider audience. In other words, anyone who's thinking about getting into architectural rendering or product rendering or even just animation for fun will suddenly find that the cost, the barrier for entry has been effectively removed. If you can run it hardware-wise, you can run Twinmotion. And generally, when it comes to software, we tend to stick with what we first start using. If you start learning Lumion or D5 or Enscape, we generally tend to stick with it for quite a number of years until we either move on or there's a paradigm shift. But either way, by making the software free, you've effectively brought in a whole new generation of potential users. This is not necessarily a criticism, merely an observation. The next major area of growth or criticism, or whatever terminology you want to use, is foliage. Right now, the foliage library in Twinmotion is by any measure pretty poor, and please don't take criticism here as condemnation. It's not, it's just, and this is very much my opinion, you can do a lot with the foliage in Twinmotion, but there's not enough choice, and what choice there is doesn't really allow you to do a huge amount. Now, the most recent version of Twinmotion does come with a fantastic foliage material. This is a great new material that allows you to bring in your own foliage or trees from outside, apply the foliage material, and have pretty stunning results. And it looks great. Looks good with Lumion and the Path Tracer. The question, though, is should you have to? Part of a real-time rendering engine is, again, the idea that you don't have to go elsewhere, that it's ready to go out of the box. It's definitely an area that could be improved. And the fact that we have an amazing collection of Quixel Megascan scanned trees available in the Unreal Engine does sort of imply that there wouldn't be an issue just adding these to Twinmotion. Now, I'm sure it's not as easy as that behind the scenes, but it's certainly something they could possibly look at, and I think would, again, benefit a lot of the users. There are great collections of foliage out there, Globe, Max Tree, but they are expensive. And now, we mentioned at the start, the hardware and price and expense. Twinmotion, by being free, is automatically just an incredible boon. It's awesome. Now, the flip of that is the expense of the hardware required to run it, but then also if you have to go elsewhere to get additional models, then that actually, it's not, strictly speaking, free. You're basically having a forced expense on top of you if you want to get the best out of the software. So it's free is caveat free. The next issue is potentially the pace of change. Now, ever since Twinmotion was acquired by Epic, the rate of updates and technological advancements within Twinmotion have been staggeringly fast. And in the case of things like the Path Tracer and Lumion, really, really impressive. Now, the flip side with that is that every time you update and come out with a new version, you do tend to give rise to a huge host of bugs and performance issues. Now, this is a part of just the software development cycle. It's pretty much to be expected. Whenever a new version comes out, there will be bugs. The problem is, though, that as you keep pumping out versions up to about, I think at this rate, they're at like 3 a year, I think. It basically means that that's 3 times a year that users are forced to maybe stop projects or just kind of go, okay, I'm going to hold off and not use the current version or the newest version until it's been stabilized. Now, generally it's understood if you're doing project-based stuff that you do not update your current version of whatever software you're using until the project is done. But that's not necessarily made abundantly clear to everybody. And I think that is a bit of an issue. You could have an update, for example, going from the 23 version to the newest 24 versions. That had a massively revamped lighting system, which again meant that if you were working on a project and you did update, you kind of had to start lighting your scene all over from scratch again. It's a small thing, but the more often you update your software, the more you open it up to bugs and issues. The last issue I have for Twinmotion, or the last criticism, if you will, really pertains to the library. Again, Twinmotion is angling itself now as something more than just an architectural rendering software. But if we, for example, take a look at the server base, so it's an online library of models for D5, which is, I think, pushing about 8,000 objects at this point. And then you look at the asset library within Twinmotion, separate to basically the Quixel content and separate to the Sketchfab integration, and it does kind of look a little bit lacking. Now, I'm not implying that this is easy. Making 3D models is hard. Making them optimized and giving them really beautiful texture maps and making them ready to go, literally drag and drop, is also quite difficult. Or, as I mentioned before, you pay for it. And so one issue here is really when you look at the decorative objects within Twinmotion, and particularly when you look at the figures, you'll actually notice that they look pretty bad. Some of the decorative objects have not aged well, and the human characters in particular look really, really bad. Now, these issues are not necessarily per se going to stop you from using Twinmotion, and you can actually work around them pretty easily, but it is definitely something worth noting. The standard for objects has gotten higher, and I don't necessarily think that Twinmotion has met that just yet. There are some beautiful models, the newer ones in particular, and some of the automotive models look great, but even the automotive models have limited options. This last point is somewhat subjective, but when it comes to the community around the software, in other words, the users and how willing they are to engage with other people, I've noticed that at least on the Twinmotion Facebook groups, of which there are a number, Twinmotion does have one of, I think, the more toxic groups. There are lots and lots of people who post, and those groups are very much alive and kicking. However, if you actually look at the comments within those groups, they tend to be, to my mind and experience, somewhat very, very negative. There does seem to be a handful of core Twinmotion users who are very critical of other people's work and seem to think that by belittling others, they kind of raise their own standing. Now, some of them have earned this status. They're very good. They're power users. They know an awful lot about the program, the underpinnings, the software, but they also seem to very much take a bit of pleasure in basically dismantling new users. They can be unnecessarily critical and harsh, and it does not make for the best atmosphere. Now, strictly speaking, obviously, Twinmotion, Epic, is not responsible for what people say or do on their groups, but it is something to be mindful of. The flip of this is Twinmotion support. Now, I've had to reach out to Twinmotion support a couple of times in the last few years to do with Twinmotion on school computers and the issues around setting up accounts and things like that. And Twinmotion support has been absolutely brilliant. Not only do they genuinely seem to listen to your concerns, they don't respond with stock support answers. They do seem to go out of their way to help you, to open a dialogue, and are willing to work with you to fix your issues. And this, we should point out, was for the educational version of Twinmotion. So strictly speaking, we were not paying for support. It was just really good. Now, that is the type of thing you hope you never actually have to encounter with software. But if you do, you really want to have a support experience like what you'll get, in my experience, with Twinmotion or Epic's support. It's really very, very good. And I'm very glad that they are as good as they are. Now, the first thing I'm going to say is you cannot really address Lumion 2024 critically without acknowledging Lumion 2023. It was a seismic change, going from 12.5, a fully rasterized but very stable and highly regarded version of Lumion, to 2023, which was a new build, entirely built from the ground up, introduced ray tracing. Problem with 2023 was it wasn't, strictly speaking, very good. Now, I'm not implying that it wasn't hard work or the developers don't deserve mad props for it. Absolutely do. But it was extremely problematic. You were trying to present a new tool, a new ray tracing module, which is amazing, while at the same time trying to stay up to date with the competition from the Path Tracer and Lumion, Enscape merging sort of with V-Ray, the rise of sort of D5, and the product itself just wasn't good enough. The last time I did this video and I looked at it, we talked about the warbling. That was a really big deal. The renders just looked warbly. They weren't great. Now, that is gone, by the way. We'll point that out. But the point is, 2023 was, in my mind, not a good release. It'll go down in history as basically, along with other programs that released, like SketchUp, whose 2023 version was buggy and problematic. One way to sort of emphasize the point is, for years, Lumion is what I taught at my school, and we were really excited to jump on the 2023 bandwagon, But it was so problematic that we eventually just stopped using it and switched over entirely to Twinmotion. The students found that 2023 was unstable. It would randomly kind of crash. It wouldn't save projects no matter what type of save you did, whether it was file save as, or save in specific areas. And we also found that when we would load up projects from SketchUp, things just didn't transfer over. So it was extremely problematic. Not to mention the ray tracing was hard to work with and slow. This was running on 3090s with something like 20 gigs of RAM. I mean, these were on workstations, and they still couldn't get it to run properly. On top of that, there were issues with the color correction module. It just wasn't responsive, and it made working with Lumion 2023 not fun. Now, again, we should point out, criticism is not condemnation. Building software and doing this stuff, utilizing it and making the programs work is unbelievably hard work. But this brings us to the other issue, which is price. And Lumion is expensive. There's no other way around that. Currently, a 1-year subscription is $1,499 US per year. That is staggering. I mean, that is really, really expensive. You can compare that with Twinmotion, where the price is free. I mean, there's another way to put it. Lumion is expensive software. Now, please keep in mind, it is not intended necessarily for people for whom $1,500 is a lot of money. If you're an architectural firm, and we should point out, there's 100,000 Lumion users out there. There's a lot of users out there, many of whom will find the $1,500 just it's not even an issue. It's just the price you pay for whether you're buying hardware, like new workstations, and just buying the software. It's just factored into their business and probably passed on to the customer. And that's totally cool. For the rest of us, though, it is a substantial burden. And even though Lumion tries to encourage you to buy a 3-year subscription, I think a lot of users were burnt with the issues with Lumion 2023 and probably looked elsewhere. Now, I don't think you should do that if you're using 2024 and you're okay with the cost. Lumion 2024 is really, really good. There's just no other way around it. It is very pleasurable to use again, and the results are pretty sweet. I think, to my mind, it's really ignited an interest in going back to it, and I think this year the school will bring it back. The other thing I do want to mention is support. The support is also top-notch. The few times that I've had to reach out to Lumion support, usually for something to do with the school, they have been incredibly good, and they responded quickly with really good instructions, and they were on point. Their fix for the technical issue I was having was absolutely spot on. They were really good to work with. They were responsive, they were clear, they were direct. All in all, absolutely great. In addition, the community within Lumion, especially if you're on the side of the Lumion forum, is really good. To my experience, users seem up for conversations. There's a dialogue. The actual developers of Lumion, the community managers, are on point and do a really good job responding to and taking feedback. Now, there is limits to what they can say and talk about, but generally I found that community to be very good and very positive. And again, this is not something you can put a value on, but it is really worthwhile if you're a Lumion user or thinking of hopping on the Lumion bandwagon. Something to keep in mind. The first criticism we'd have is the update pace. Now, it seems to be on average that D5, the developers, are releasing roughly something around the lines of 3 major updates pretty much every year since about 2021. And that's separate to the point updates that they've done sort of incrementally as well. Now, we should point out, this is a very good thing on one way. It shows the developers are taking feedback really to heart. It also shows that they're serious about the program. It shows that they plan on developing and continue to grow the program. The problem is that when you have such a voracious rate of updates, There's a couple of issues that presents. The first is it's problematic for users who are sort of maybe wanting to stay up to date with the latest version, because it introduces generally a host of bugs and issues. The problem also with this is there are still lingering issues going back to D5's early days that have been left unfixed. Example of this is displacement mapping. Now, Lumion in particular does a great job with displacement mapping. It is faux or pseudo displacement mapping. The mesh is not really being edited in any way. You're just affecting the overall look of the geometry. But this was something that D5 did okay in the earlier versions, and its integration actually seems to have gotten kind of worse. There are times when displacement mapping, we should point out, D5 does not do true mesh displacement mapping, to the best of my knowledge, but it actually doesn't look very good. There are sliders to control the strength of it, but effectively what you're doing is sort of adding almost the appearance of another normal map on top of the other normal map. Quite simply, it just doesn't work very well. The second criticism we might have for D5 is that, quite simply, there is a D5 look to all of the renders. Now, this part you might find somewhat subjective, but because the sort of D5 ecosystem is very self-contained, it's all the exact same sort of ray tracing underpinning the renders, and we're all using, in many ways, very samey lighting. So, for example, a lot of people, we mentioned one of the benefits of D5 is you can download these sort of pre-made lighting systems. But the problem with that is all renders have started to look the same. Unlike Twinmotion and its handling of light with real skies, or Lumion's real skies, or use of FX Stack, renders in D5 lack an artistic element. Now, I'm not saying you can't be artistic with your camera placement and your lighting placement. You can. But ultimately, because of this push for hyper photorealism, the renders do start to look very much the same. I would potentially argue that your ability to be more artistic in your renders with D5 is somewhat limited. The renders tend to be extremely sharp. They kind of overall do tend to take on a very similar look and appearance. One thing to note about D5 is the community that surrounds it. This might be a controversial take, but because the barrier for entry into D5 is so low, it has meant that you don't necessarily have to be proficient in 3D terminology. You don't have to be a 3D artist. You don't have to have a background in design. Pretty much anyone can pick it up and play it. Now, here's the thing. That is both really good in terms of egalitarian sort of leveling the playing field. It opens up 3D rendering to a whole new audience, which in many ways is really, really good. The flip of this is there is really no bar for entry, so anyone can play around with D5 and then sort of sell themselves perhaps as a 3D artist or a landscape designer or an architectural rendering artist. And because architectural rendering is effectively, it's a for-profit industry, you do it because you enjoy it, but you also want to make money doing it, I think it leads to a higher level of toxicity amongst the users. In other words, everyone is now fighting for the same slice of pie, using the same software, getting the same results. And I think it breeds a level of unpleasant competition. The D5 Facebook groups in particular, I think, are quite toxic. There's an awful lot of belittlement of new members, of new users of D5, or people who are just dabbling and want some maybe feedback. Like Twinmotion, there are a handful of power users who seem to enjoy putting other people down. And often comments when people ask for criticism will be something along the lines of learn the software or get good, which isn't really very helpful, and as an educator is not really very positive at all. Now, I am extremely cynical when it comes to AI tools, full stop, but I've recently had a chance to explore some of the AI tool integration within D5, and it is brilliant. There's no other way to describe it. They've taken what I think is the best approach with AI technology, which is not an attempt to replace a user, but more looking at it, how can you use AI tools to enhance your workflow? Whether it's the creation of normal maps and procedural maps using AI technology based on just a diffuse map, or it's the AI enhancer module, which is, I have to admit, really, really impressive. It's not perfect, but in its current iteration, I've been blown away by it. The D5 team is taking AI tools and they're making your workflow and your enjoyment of the software better. And I think that is the way it should be done. It's not an attempt to make the artist irrelevant. It's an attempt to make their life easier and better. And I think that is really absolutely great. I can't wait to see what other new tools they develop, because the current ones are really very good. One last comment on D5 and what I would see as room for improvement is the interface. As the program grows and develops and matures, it adds effectively more and more operability. Now, the problem with that is your original minimalized interface that was very user accessible is fast becoming very, very cluttered. And even though, you can get very comfortable with D5 very, very quickly, the individual elements are all starting to blend together. There's not enough effort, I think, in terms of the user interface to separate out different modules. If you look at like the environment tab and the effects tab on the top right of the screen, it all blends into one slightly homogeneous mess. Now, again, this is just the result of the program growing and developing and adding new and amazing toys to play with. But I do think the interface is due for a slightly fresh overhaul in hopefully this year or starting next.